So
Yep.
let's kick it off, Andy.
Yep. Welcome to season 2, episode 5 of Baseline Tech Talk Tuesday. This is the Ask Us Anything episode because what you put into it is what you get out of it. So we hope everybody participates as much as you feel comfortable with. And it's just going to be Chris and I. Dan Conger's off doing whatever Dan likes to do in the real world when he's not working.
Not sure what that is. I think he likes to hike periodically, but
he does. He does.
Yeah.
Carry heavy stuff in his backpack. So if you're joining us for the first time, you can catch all of season 1 and all the previous 24 episodes here of season 2 on YouTube. It's Baseline Web Training, all one word, on YouTube. And Dan's always putting out new content, new how-to, quick tips, and YouTube is quickly becoming the best place to find answers to your questions that you might have about support, troubleshooting, or how to set up and program your controller. So, definitely. Chris, just you and I, man, I'm a little bit nervous about what we might say or not say today.
Well, I'm not nervous about it, but I'm definitely interested in some of the questions that may come in from users on how to interface with Baseline products. So we've got question number 1 in already. Mr. Bannock, this is a good question. And I realize also that it is a little perhaps irritating, but the question is, so how many of 6 or 7 thumb drives do I need for updates?
You have to try 10. That's the minimum required.
So, yeah, that's a good question. We realize that you have to have a whole key ring full of thumb drives, especially if you're updating from legacy version 12 or earlier. And the reason why we do that is because a lot of it is based on the quality of the thumb drive that you have. Thumb drives are readily available. They're not expensive. And sometimes they aren't very good at, sorting files that look similar on them. So we recommend that to have success, just make sure that you've got one version of firmware that you are going to be updating on the thumb drive at a time when you are going through an extended update of firmware on 3200.
And I think we should talk a little bit about the why. Let's get under the hood here for a second. So if we rolled back to the beginning of Baseline time up until about version 16 or 17, it was a folder, and the folder was called update. That's all it was called. Every version of the update still had the same folder name. And so you could only have one folder on a thumb drive with the same name, right? You could, if you knew what you were doing, just rename the folder and potentially put them all on there and go one by one and update the right ones. But that's like a level 10 that people can't always get to. And so you just want the one update folder on there, extracted from the zip format into its raw native state. And then it was either 16 or 17, Chris, that we moved from an update folder over to that .bin file format. So the actual way the controllers got upgraded was changed. And so just to try to keep it simple and provide clarity for the user, and also from a support side to know what someone has on there, and it can be tricky to try to explain, download this, extract that, put it here, all of that when you're on the phone with somebody. So anyway, those are kind of the little under the hood, how and why it does that.
Yep, for sure. It's a good question. Again, we realize it's a bit much to have that many, but it just ensures a clean and successful update if you're especially moving from versions to versions, like 1234 to 16 to 17 to 18, et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, good question. And then he follows up and asks, always back up first, correct? Yes. Yeah, it's always good.
Been there, done that, made that mistake, fixed it, but had a little bit of a heartache for a few minutes.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to back it up so that you've got a most current version of the configuration and programming on it. If you don't, or something goes wrong in the process, we can back up from Base Manager the programs or configuration that existed on the Sunday night prior to when.
Right, because the auto backup is a once a week scenario.
Correct. Yep. So,
yep.
Good question. All right, we got another one that's come in. Mr. Noonan wants to know what the release date is for the SubStation RV. So, status of the RV is it is finishing up in engineering. We are prepping to go into beta, and we're targeting a release probably September, October.
I think we should do a recap of what RV is for those that may not even be aware of what SubStation is. Hopefully everybody realizes a SubStation is a wireless zone access point, if you will, of the 3200 platform. So what's the RV?
So Chris? The RV designates remote valves. So it's like a little brother, if you will, of the substation, where it will support 4 zones of conventional wire, and it is solar powered or AC powered, but it's essentially a 4-station decoder built into its own standalone powered box that will help you tie in zones that may not have access to the controller, or wire paths that are severed or no longer viable. So you can tie those remote zones into the 3200. Yeah. Now, the beautiful thing about it is, if you recall, a 3200 will support 200 zones, right? So, and a substation itself will support up to 100 zones potentially. And then a SubStation RV will support up to 4 zones of conventional wire. So we can have 8 substations assigned to a 3200. And in addition to that, we'll be able to assign up to 25 SubStation RVs to that 3200 as well.
Okay. And just to clarify, the RV does or does not have 2-wire capability?
Does not have 2-wire capability. Will only support conventional wires. Now, the other iteration of it will be the SubStation CP, which is Substation Control Point, and that unit will support a flow sensor, a master valve decoder, and a pressure transducer decoder. All at
which are 2-wire devices. And if you're looking to add other decoders and a full wireless 2-wire capability, then you would use a standard substation.
Correct. Yep. So we're looking at this fall for release. It's we're behind where we wanted to be with the release of it, based on other engineering, scopes and roadmaps that we had to address this summer, and also. It's getting more and more difficult to secure raw materials for, extensive builds of product. And, we're just working to make sure that we've got enough of the raw materials to get them built and get them out to market.
The good news though, Chris, remember, industry standard is to give a release date and actually release it 2 years later. So we're well ahead of industry standard.
Absolutely.
For those of you that know what I'm talking about, inside joke.
Inside joke. For sure. So I have a question. I want everybody to type into the chat or the Q&A if they've had opportunity to review the new website that was launched this day last week, right before we started Tech Talk Tuesday. So just want some feedback from users on the navigation of the website, if you've got any of it. And then if you've had opportunity as well to access the knowledge base to get information that you may need regarding, supporting baseline on some of your projects or sites. So get a chance, drop that into the chat as well. I'd like to hear that. So, prior to the episode, Andy, we were, discussing what would we talk about if we got crickets on the other end of this episode. And we came back to, talking about baseline controllers being sensor-based controller platforms. So, maybe some of the things that we can discuss is, and have, users question us on, is how do I implement different sensors into my baseline system, and why? Why would I want to do that?
Yeah, I think the why is definitely, why is the reason, that I guess maybe I won't answer that so we can get some feedback, but I think the why is really important. And, 20 years ago, humans had to make all the decisions, and that isn't necessarily the case anymore. We're here to provide some framework and some structure and some setup to that, but there's, not going to necessarily say better ways of watering. There's different ways to do it now that weren't available before.
Yeah. So if I think about it, it's about implementing these different sensors to help automate the operation of the system and to allow us to measure different parameters so we can manage the performance of the system overall, right? Without those data points, then we wouldn't be able to have as much resolution on how well the system is operating at any given time, or if it's operating within, the constraints of the mainline size and the water window that's available to us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if your single job was to look after one property, one irrigation system, you could probably do a really good job. If that was your singular focus, look at the watering, look at the landscape, manual adjustments, because that's all you did. And maybe you could do 2 or 3 properties too, but there does become a point where you can't scale human. You can't scale that level of, intent and effort on a site. And so we need these sites to be smarter, as close to making decisions that the human would make and better, but doing it on their own, can scale the effort across as many sites as possible and get similar or same or better results.
Yep. Results in better efficiencies for not only the operation of the system, but also, management of your time in having to manage the site. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So since we're not getting all these questions in, I know that there are a lot of sites out there that are running baseline controls without flow. So why would we want to have flow sensors on our system to help us manage it better?
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay, I'm going to zip it. Please, somebody put in the chat why we should have flow.
What are the primary reasons why we would use a flow sensor on a single main line, or on a more complex site with multiple main lines coming from different water sources? And as we're waiting for those answers to come in, I already have, my own thoughts as to why. Mm-hmm. And when we get support calls that come in, and support's trying to help a client on a site, and if they don't have flow associated with it, it makes it much more difficult to, really comprehend or understand the issues that the user may be having on the site. Right. So Mr. Hodnet, he answered and submitted, it's for station level leak detection and flow management. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so that brings up, the issue that you and I were dealing with this morning, right? In real time on a site that had a flow variance and a mainline shutdown, and there was some confusion as to why the mainline shut down and not just the individual zones that were operating at the time that the variance was measured. So just to clarify, Okay, because we have the ability to operate more than one zone at a time based on flow, managed by flow, checking that box, managing by flow, means that we can have the learned flows of the individual zones so that there's an expected flow, and then measure based as a percentage of that learned flow of variance, so we can know if we've got a single zone break or if it's a mainline break.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in this case, there were two zones that were running at one time. I believe it was zone 26 and zone 37, right? And it triggered a flow variance. So it was flowing more water than was expected from those two zones. So it then went and selected another zone, one zone or two zones based on the flow parameters, and ran one of those zones again. So in this case, zone 37 ran again with two additional zones. Okay, mm-hmm. So 37 was associated with two high flow variances. So it then took zone 25 or zone 26, excuse me, that was running in the first group and ran it with other zones, and it saw zone 26 have its second flow variance association. So at that point, it shut down the main line because it saw two consecutive high flow variances associated with two zones that were part of the original group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's pretty fascinating. It does that in that real-time sequence. It doesn't say, whoa, stop this, let me just run this. It continues in its normal operation, looking for these little, looking for those discrepancies so that it can keep optimizing your water window, your hydraulics, all of that.
Yep, exactly. So you put into the chat, Andy, a fill in the blank. So somebody fill in the blank based on Andy's what point that you're making there?
Yeah, it's kind of about that blank, right? With a lot of things and a lot of sensors, because it's really about that. And sometimes that can create the picture for either the user or the client, because otherwise you just see the sprinklers come on and you see water, but you can't connect the dots onto what it means. How much is it? Is that the right amount it should be? What was it last week, last month, last year? What do we want it to be? Do we want to set some goals around it? Do we want to increase it if we're not using enough? If we want to decrease it if we're using too much? But without it, you really can't make any of the, logical decisions that need to be made.
That's right. Yep. And the fill in the blank has been repeated several times as measure. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. So Ron Yoakum, he gave us some input. He says his system pumps from a pond. I can't tell if the pump is really working if I can't see the flow.
That's right.
Right. So pump stations, whether it's a booster pump or a full-blown main point of connection pump station, if it doesn't have a flow sensor associated with it that's connected to the baseline controller, then we're not able to see that flow when it's occurring. And then by association of that, we can't measure it to manage it correctly either. Yeah. So even if you have a pump station on your system, it's important to have a flow sensor so that you can, validate, verify, and see the results of the operation of it.
Yeah, it's kind of that feedback loop. We put inputs into the system, turn on, I want you to do this. We give it inputs, and that's one way to look at it. The measuring something or the data is the input coming back to us that either closes the loop and gives us the acknowledgement that it's doing what it should be. If we don't get it back, then it's an open loop and we can go investigate what's happening. But it's that feedback loop.
Yep. So, and Greg just put in, if program runs multiple zones, how does the system figure a flow variance? So kind of explain that already. How about you reiterate that, Andy?
And it's like wizardry. Do you really need to know how Harry Potter does what he does?
Yes, we do.
Well, the controller knows what the learned flow is of all the zones. So if you're running 3 zones and you have that variance, it knows what it should be. And oftentimes one zone will turn off while the other 2 are running, and then another one will be added to the group. So if we're running 3, it really just looks for that variance along the way. And that's how it can spot the difference, because it knows what it should be of those 3 combined, and it knows what the input variance is. And so as zones are coming in or coming on and coming off, it looks for that. And if it sees that happen more than once over time with different zones, then it knows that it must be a mainline break, because that same variance, that same high flow or low flow continues to happen over time with different zones. If it goes away, then it knew it was only that singular zone in the group.
That's right. So we utilize a 3-strike rule, essentially. So if we see 3 consecutive operations with high flow variance associated with a zone, or more than one zone, if it's just one zone, it'll shut down that one zone. If it's multiple zones, it's going to shut down the main line. Mm-hmm. If they show up more than once in the same grouping while it's operating.
Yep. Antonio mentions here that the float sensor can help maximize the capacity of the main line, which is absolutely true. If you have a 4-inch main line and a source available to provide the capacity of a 4-inch main line, but you're running it like it's 1.5 inches or a 2-inch, what's the point of all of that infrastructure investment, right? You want to be able to operate the system the way it was engineered to be possible to operate it.
Yep. So that brings, that's a great segue into the next sensor type, and that's pressure, right? So why would you use pressure in the system to enhance performance? Why do you want to measure it, and how can it manage?
Mm-hmm. So anybody put some thoughts in the chat here, guys. We'd love to hear what you're using it for, or what you're thinking you could use it for, or any other creative idea.
While we're waiting for some feedback to come in, Bannock asked a great question. He asked, can we now in maps add substations and control points? And the answer is yes. So you can now add substations and flow stations in the mapping on the site level map. And then you can add the control points on the controller level map. Mm-hmm. So if you've logged in recently, since last Friday, and interfaced with your site and controllers menu on the side of Base Manager, you'll notice that the substations are now nested underneath the controller that they are communicating to. So now if you've got 3200 on a site, or maybe you've got 2 3200s on a site, you've got substations that are pointing back to them, you'll now be able to tell where those, or what 3200 those substations are connected to in that sites and controllers drop down on the left side of Base Manager, so you know which ones are connected to the 3200. So huge improvement in this new server role.
Yeah. And those are what doesn't change the functionality. It's just the user interface, which is all about efficiency. Because if you can use Base Manager and spend 10 minutes, we'd rather that than use Base Manager and spend an hour. Yep. Efficiency matters.
Absolutely. And if you're on a larger site where you've got controllers sharing a water source or sources, and you've got a flow station associated with it, then the flow station will be listed first. And then the 3200s will be nested under it that are pointed at that flow station or managed by that flow station. And then the substations will be nested under the 3200. So now we've got a good hierarchy of network configuration of the different controllers and performance components, so you know what is connected to what.
Yeah, we've got good response here. Thanks, Tom Shannon. He mentions that when reclaim supplies diminish, we can pause the system using a pressure sensor, and you could substitute reclaim supply for really any supply, whether it's priority 1 or a second or a supply. Absolutely. And then, that really tells the user, if they're not paying attention, they might say, how come my system is just never really running? Why is it paused all the time? Well, maybe you don't have the supply available. Maybe it's diminishing.
Could be the case. Absolutely. Right. And then we can use that pressure sensor to create a start, stop, or pause condition or an empty condition, depending on how it is used. So we can, use it in a cistern or a well to measure level. And when that well or cistern runs out of water, we can then automate and transition to a different water source, or we can pause that water source, allow it to recharge over time, and use a different water source in the meantime. And then once that paused water source is refilled, it can then resume being used, so that you're always using that secondary water source optimally, then not being forced to always use potable municipal water.
Yep. And the flow is one part of one data point, right? Flow, and pressure is the other data point. So if we go back to what we were talking about, flow variance, let's just say, for instance, there's continuous low flow variances occurring. Checking the pressure information over time is another data point to look at to see if that has anything to do with this low flow variance. Maybe there's a pattern of low pressure happening in the system that can be part of the cause of the low flow variance happening.
Definitely. Yes. Absolutely.
And they're great tools, remotely too, because sometimes when you're on site, you can sort of see what's happening. But when you're remote, you're basically completely blind. And so the more data points you have to paint the picture of what is happening on the site when you are not there can be very helpful for diagnosing.
For sure. So let me see here. Got another question that came in. Easiest way to find serial numbers associated with zones in Base Manager.
Ooh, there's a new, I think another enhancement there that came out on Friday. Is that right?
I believe so. That's what I'm just looking up. I'm in Base Manager right now.
And I think check the devices tab. I think that's where all the serial numbers are. I think they're listed now in their own column. If I'm not mistaken. Or it was in programs.
Yeah, it was part of the release notes that Bob sent to us that I haven't studied in depth yet. But
yeah, and that is a common question. You're troubleshooting and you see it's zone 7, and that sometimes doesn't really matter. You want to know what specific, decoder address is this?
Yeah. Let's see. If someone from Baseline has access, that has access to those release notes and can look that up real quick, that'd be awesome for us. But we're almost out of time. 30 minutes, just boom, like that.
Yeah. If you happen to have your controller on, Chris, just take a look and either click on the open a program or open devices. I think the devices tab now, instead of having to open each device one by one to get that number, I think it's now listed as a column.
Yep, that is true. So if I share my screen real quick, you can see.
You're not on here, by the way.
Huh?
We're not seeing your screen on this end.
You're not?
No, it's the darn Zoom multiple screen. Which one am I showing situation?
How can you see it?
No.
Oh. Anyway, if you go to devices, the devices tab and click on zones, then it now lists the zone number, then the serial number for that zone, the device that it's connected to, and the serial number of that device it's connected to. So if it's connected to a substation, it will tell you in that drop down that it's connected to a substation rather than 3200. If it's directly connected to the 3200, it'll indicate it's connected directly to it.
And that's the idea. Spend less time. We want to be more efficient. We know that these things are available to help us be faster and better. And we're starting to have some great improvements on the UI in that regard.
All right. So our time is up. We didn't get to moisture sensors or the precip sensor. So maybe we just need to continue this conversation again in an upcoming episode. Had some great feedback from you all. Thanks for the engagement and the questions coming in. We'll let you get back to work now. And, we appreciate you spending a half hour with us again this week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
So with that, go out, work hard, be safe, and we will see you back here next Tuesday. Same bat time, same bat station.
Nice.
All right. Have a great day.
Blame it on the rain. See you later.
Bye-bye.